This is the word of God. Please be seated. So this passage in Matthew, referred to as the Sermon on the Mount, might arguably be the most well-known of all of Jesus' teachings. Look at the things contained within the Sermon on the Mount. The Beatitudes, what we just read about salt and light. Jesus' instruction on several things like anger and murder, lust and adultery, divorce and remarriage, oaths. The phrase an eye for an eye comes out of this sermon. Love your enemies comes from this sermon. Give to the needy. How to pray, the Lord's Prayer, comes from the Sermon on the Mount. Storing up treasures in heaven was included in there. Ask, seek, and knock is in the Sermon on the Mount. The narrow gate, false prophets, and the wise builder. All of those things are contained within this set of teachings that Jesus started when Matthew picks up the story. I believe that there's two really important things that we need to take away from this Sermon on the Mount. But first we have to do a little background. Earlier in Matthew, we heard about Jesus' baptism by John, his calling of his disciples, his retreat into the desert where he was tempted by Satan, and then Jesus and his disciples, according to Matthew, began teaching all about Galilee, all over the place. We don't know if Jesus started to climb this unnamed mountain to seek maybe a brief refuge from the multitudes that had started following him, or maybe it was to gain a better vantage point in order to engage more of them. We do know, however, Matthew says that Jesus, during this collection of teachings, started talking to the disciples. By the end of this time, of all this time of preaching and teaching on the mountain, we know there was, once again, a multitude listening in. Here then are two characteristics of Jesus' time preaching that I think are important. Firstly, with this sermon, Jesus changes the focus of the law. Jesus shocks us with his claims. We think he's going to say, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law. I have not come to abolish them, but to confirm them." That's not what he says. He says, "I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." Jesus was not just another member in the long line of wise men and prophets. He was the end of the line. In his own person and work, the law and the prophets were fulfilled. Thus began a game changer. Flashback to the time when Jesus had disobeyed his parents by remaining in Jerusalem instead of returning with the rest of the caravan. You with me? Remember where he was found once they realized he was missing? Luke 2:41 records it like this. Every year Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. When he was 12 years old, they went up to the festival according to the custom. After the festival was over, while his parents were returning home, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but they were unaware of it. Thinking he was in their company, they traveled on for a day. Then they began looking for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they went back to Jerusalem to look for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. So at this point in Jewish history, the only thing that was contained in the scriptures was the law. Do this, don't do this, avoid this, practice this, remember this, obey this, follow this, and on and on and on. The new covenant with Israel hasn't happened yet, even though the very vehicle for that covenant was the 12-year-old boy that they were talking to. Up until the time Jesus heads up the mountain to start talking to his disciples, God's people had only known about the law and God's covenant that they would be his people. That was it. A bunch of rules and the promise that you will always be mine. It never went anywhere past that. If you remember most of what you read in the Old Testament, you recall God's people never really obeyed him, did they? They were threatened with annihilation often. So, back up on the mountain with Jesus and the disciples. This first section of the Sermon on the Mount contains the Beatitudes, which we read last week. The Beatitudes place the emphasis on what we are as opposed to what we do. Let that sink in for a minute. The emphasis is not on what we do, which you could say is the law. Do this, don't do that. But what we are. It deals with the relationship of Jesus Christ to the law, that he came to fulfill the law, and the main focus of this whole compilation of Jesus' teachings is this. God is our Father who sees and cares about the heart, not just external righteous deeds and religion. The law was still important. The law was still applicable. But for the first time in the history of God's people, there is hope that God will start to look at the heart of the followers. The Sermon on the Mount declares to us that we are, what we are through the grace of God working in our lives, and because of what we are. We are the poor in spirit. We are those that mourn. We are those that are persecuted for his name's sake. But for the first time, we've just been blessed, not because of the law and our never-ending ability to follow it, but because of our relationship with God. That was number one. The second major aspect of this Sermon on the Mount is this. Jesus established his authority when he had concluded the Sermon on the Mount. It says in Matthew chapter 7, verse 28, the people were astounded at his doctrine, for he taught them as one having authority. He taught with authority. In their particular culture, that meant he quoted nobody. He footnoted nothing. He didn't say he had gotten this truth from somewhere else, or from some eminent rabbi, or from some other teacher. He didn't say that this was an exposition of some commentary written by some respected person of another time. He just spoke with authority. 6 times in Matthew 5, Jesus says, but I say to you. Later on in Matthew 7, Jesus says this, not everyone who says to, I'm going to do some emphasis here, okay, so pay attention. Not everyone who says to me, now this is Jesus talking, not Jeff. I'll go back. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? And in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. And continuing on, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine. Jesus was the authority. He boldly declared, God is my Father. I have the keys to the heaven. This morning, if you hear nothing else from me, please at least remember this. Jesus changed the rules. He offered hope for those of us who can't keep the letter of the law, and he declared himself to have the power and authority to do that. Jesus tells us he has the keys to the kingdom, and that we have not been locked out because of our sinful nature. We have been blessed. We will be blessed. So right now you will be thinking, well, that's something I hadn't realized before, or, well, everybody already knew that, or, wow, I feel a whole lot better about my relationship with my Savior, or, I hope Lucille brought deviled eggs, or any number of feelings you may be thinking. But probably you're also thinking, what does that have to do with the city on a hill? I'm glad you asked. As you mostly know by now, I used to teach 5th grade reading and language arts. 5th graders are at an exceptional point in their learning lives. They figured out the how-to of reading, sight words, spelling, grammar, and they go from learning to read to reading to learn. They've been a few years past decoding words and identifying subject and action. They are entering the worlds of figurative language, my all-time favorite. For those of us who have been out of 5th grade for a while, here's a refresher on what figurative language is. Metaphor, simile, nod if these are coming back to you, hyperbole, personification, alliteration, onomatopoeia, idiom. No? We'll talk during coffee. Using language in the figurative way adds so many layers to meaning, more than just the face value of the words. Some of my former students could say that Mr. Jeude was big, or Mr. Jeude was fat. Or they could say, Mr. Jeude is a mountain. Mr. Jeude is so large that it would take 3 Pony Express riders to travel around him. Mr. Jeude is a misshapen mound of monumental monster. Mr. Jeude's belly bounces to the beat of its own drummer. And so on. Each one of those are ways of saying more than just, Mr. Jeude, you're fat. God, I love my kids. I love them. Jesus is much nicer than a 5th grader. But Jesus also loved figurative language. There are 3 examples in the scriptures this morning. They're all metaphors, by the way. You are the light of the world. You are the salt of the earth. You are a city on a hill. Jesus' use of metaphor, which is actually, in my opinion, the strongest figurative language tool, is meant to help us understand what it is we are to do with this new information, specifically that Jesus is offering us the keys to heaven, and he has the power to do that. What then are we supposed to do? We are to be salt. We are to be light. We are to be a city on a hill. When Jesus was beginning his ministry, the earth looked substantially different than the one we inhabit today. There were no street lamps, no neon signs, no outdoor advertising, no searchlights. Once the sun went down, the world was dark, very dark. Remember that parable about the 10 virgins? 5 of them had brought oil for the lamps and 5 of them had not. Those who were foolish, when they took their lamps, took no oil with them, but the wise took oil in their vessels with their lamps. Now while the bridegroom delayed, they all slumbered and slept. And the ones who didn't have a lamp could not be seen. They got passed over. Light was very important. If there was no oil in the lamp, there was no light. If there was no light, you were basically invisible. Without a light, you can't be seen. Without salt, you have no flavor. A city in a valley, can't be seen from afar. We're called to be the light, the salt, the visible city of God. Here's some more history for you. The passengers of the Arabella, who left England in 1630, with their new charter, had a great vision. They were to be an example for the rest of the world in rightful living. They were headed to Massachusetts Bay Colony. Future Governor John Winthrop stated their purpose quite clearly. We shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us. The phrase was used once again in Ronald Reagan's farewell speech. He said this: "The past few days when I've been at the window upstairs, I've thought a bit of the shining city upon a hill." The phrase comes from John Winthrop, who wrote it to describe the America he imagined. What he imagined was important because he was an early pilgrim, an early freedom man. He journeyed here on what today we'd call a little wooden boat. And like the other pilgrims, he was looking for a home that would be free. I've spoken, this is still Reagan, I've spoken of the shining city all my political life, but I don't know if I ever quite communicated what I saw when I said it. In my mind, it was a tall, proud city built on rocks stronger than oceans, windswept, God-blessed, and teeming with people of all kinds living in harmony and peace. A city with free ports that hummed with commerce and creativity, and if there had to be city walls, the walls had doors, and the doors were open to anyone with the will and the heart to get there. So Jesus tells us directly, right after he announces hope for a relationship with God, that we are to be a city on a hill, not hidden, visible for all to see, approachable in every direction, strong and steadfast and resolute. Knowing that our eternal future is secure, can we be the light? Can we be the salt? Can we stand tall and strong and God-blessed, living in harmony and peace? Jesus came to set us free. He asks in return that we reflect his love. Amen.